There are athletes who win. Then there are athletes who seem to bend reality. In 1912, one man from Indian Territory walked into the Olympic Games and did something so overwhelming, so complete, that the world called him the greatest athlete alive. He was native. He was unstoppable. And for one brief moment, the whole world had to admit what America often refused to see. His name was Jim Thorpe. He won Olympic gold. He became a football legend. He played pro baseball. He helped build what would become the NFL. But 1 year after standing on top of the world, the same system that celebrated him took his medals, his reputation, and much of the future he should have had. This is not just a sports story. It is a story about greatness and what America does when greatness comes from the people it tried to erase. Jim Thorpe was born near present-day Prague in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, in the late 1880s. Sources differ slightly on the year, but what matters more is where he came from, a native world under pressure, in a country forcing indigenous people into a new order. Thorpe was of Sac and Fox Nation heritage, and later records from Carlisle identify him as a member of the Sac and Fox Nation.
His life would eventually be framed as an American success story, but that framing often hid the truth. Jim Thorpe's rise passed directly through the machinery of federal native assimilation. He attended Haskell Indian School, then the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, one of the best-known off-reservation federal boarding schools created to assimilate native children into white American society. The National Archives notes that Carlisle played a pivotal role in shaping federal boarding school policy. Source: So before Jim Thorpe was a global sports icon, he was already living inside a system trying to reshape who he was. Carlisle records show Thorpe entered the school on February 6, 1904, left in 1909, re-enrolled on September 8, 1911, and ultimately departed on February 1, 1913. Those dates matter because they place him inside Carlisle during the exact years he became impossible to ignore. Source: At Carlisle, under coach Pop Warner, Thorpe exploded into national prominence. Britannica notes that he was selected as halfback on Walter Camp's All-America teams in 1911 and 1912. He had speed, power, kicking ability, balance, and something harder to define, presence, the kind that makes a crowd feel like it's watching history before the headlines catch up. Source: This is also where the irony deepens. Carlisle used football to prove native students could be disciplined into American success. But what Thorpe proved was something else entirely. Native brilliance had never needed permission. By 1912, Jim Thorpe was no longer just a football star. He was ready for the Stockholm Olympics. At those games, he won the Pentathlon and the Decathlon by wide margins. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum calls him the first Native American to win an Olympic gold medal for the United States and emphasizes that he swept both events in Stockholm. Source: To understand how shocking this was, remember what these events demanded. Not one skill, not one body type, not one kind of intelligence. The Pentathlon and Decathlon demanded completeness. Explosive speed, strength, technique, endurance, mental control, recovery under pressure. Jim Thorpe did not merely survive those tests, he dominated them. This is the moment your documentary should breathe. Hold the music, let the visuals stay wide. Because this was the peak, the instant when the world could no longer pretend he belonged anywhere except at the top. If the Pentathlon made Thorpe famous, the Decathlon made him immortal. The Decathlon is built to expose weakness. Over 10 events, fatigue strips away illusion. But for Thorpe, event after event became proof. He was not a specialist.
He was the rarest thing in sports, a complete athlete. The IOC's official 2022 decision page confirms what everyone in Stockholm knew in real time. Thorpe won both events outright in 1912. Source: for a native athlete from Indian Territory, educated in an assimilation boarding school system, to arrive on the biggest athletic stage in the world and completely overpower it, that was more than sport. That was disruption. For a moment, the empire had to look at one native man and say, "You are the best we have ever seen." Back home, Thorpe became a sensation. Newspapers celebrated him. Crowds were fascinated by him. Sports writers began to treat him as something beyond ordinary comparison. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum presents the usual list almost with disbelief. Olympic champion, pro baseball player, pro football star, basketball barnstormer, even ballroom dancing champion. Source: and yet, even at the height of that praise, there was a trap hidden underneath it. America loved native greatness best when it could package it as spectacle, as novelty, as exception. Admiration did not mean safety. Fame did not mean protection, not for Jim Thorpe. That matters because the fall to come was not random. It came from the same culture that loved celebrating him, as long as it could still control the terms. In 1913, just a year after his Olympic triumph, an investigation by the Amateur Athletic Union found that Thorpe had played semi-professional baseball in 1909 and 1910. Under amateurism rules of the time, that should have disqualified him from Olympic competition. Source: that is the official explanation, but the emotional truth is harsher. Thorpe had done what many athletes of the era did, play for money, but others often hid it better, used aliases, or benefited from a system more willing to look away. Thorpe became the one publicly punished. Britannica's explainer states it plainly. His medals were taken after it was revealed he had earlier played semi-pro baseball. Then, decades later, he was partially restored in 1982 and fully reinstated in 2022. Source:
This is where your narration should turn from admiration to betrayal. Once Thorpe's amateur status was challenged, the Olympic machine moved quickly. His gold medals were stripped. His name was pulled from where he had earned it. The athlete who had just conquered the world was suddenly recast as a scandal. And this is the tragedy inside the scandal. Jim Thorpe did not lose those medals because he failed athletically. He lost them because sports institutions were obsessed with a version of amateur purity that often protected privilege more than fairness. The world had watched him win. Then, paperwork rewrote what the world had seen. That's why this story still hurts more than a century later. It wasn't just about medals. It was about legitimacy, about who gets remembered as rightful. Thorpe kept going. From 1913 through 1919, Britannica says he played Major League Baseball as an outfielder for New York, Cincinnati, and Boston in the National League. He later became even more important to professional football. The same Britannica source notes that he was one of the early stars of pro football from 1919 through 1926, and in 1920 to 21, he served as the first president of the American Professional Football Association, the precursor to the NFL. This is one of the strongest David versus Goliath beats in your video. They took Olympic glory from him, and instead of disappearing, he helped build the future of American sports anyway. But Thorpe's post-Olympic life was not a clean comeback story. Britannica notes that in 1922 to 23, Thorpe played for the Orang Indians, a team whose owner drew crowds by having Thorpe and his teammates dress up and perform Indian tricks before games and at halftime. That detail matters, because even while Thorpe remained one of the most gifted athletes in America,
the culture around him still wanted to reduce Native identity into entertainment. His body could be celebrated, his image could be sold, but dignity, control, and equal treatment were never guaranteed. He was still famous, but fame and power are not the same thing. Thorpe's later life was marked by instability. Britannica writes that even as magazines and newspapers celebrated him as one of the greatest athletes of all time, alcoholism and difficulty adjusting to employment outside sports reduced him to near poverty. This part of the story should not be played for pity. It should be played for contrast. The world's greatest athlete should not have ended up so vulnerable. A man who gave America unforgettable victories should not have had to live with that degree of instability and loss. And even after his death in 1953, controversy followed him. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum notes that his burial became the subject of dispute, eventually leading to his remains staying in the Pennsylvania town now called Jim Thorpe. Even in death, he was still being negotiated over. In 1982, the IOC recognized Thorpe's amateur status and restored him as a co-winner. In 1983, replacement medals were returned to his family. But that still did not fully correct the record.
Then, in 2022, the IOC officially decided that Jim Thorpe would once again be displayed as the sole gold medalist in both the Pentathlon and Decathlon at Stockholm 1912. The IOC said silver would go to the athletes previously moved up, while Thorpe's name would stand alone where it belonged all along. So how should history remember Jim Thorpe? Not as a scandal, not as a footnote, not as a what-if. History should remember him as what he was, a Native American athlete so great that the world had to invent bureaucratic ways to shrink him, and even then it failed. If you want more Native American history documentaries told with respect and real sources, subscribe. And in the comments, answer this. Was Jim Thorpe robbed more by Olympic rules or by the America that wrote them?